Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really important puzzle for anyone running web applications, especially if you're using Ruby on Rails.
Right, how to handle growth, those, sudden traffic spikes.
Exactly. Without constantly overpaying for server power, you might not even need all the time.
Yeah.
So, if you're someone who likes to get smart on tech solutions, like quickly and thoroughly, you're definitely in the right place. We're aiming for some genuinely useful insights into, well, maybe a smarter way to scale.
And for this deep dive, we're drawing from a really great interview. It's from the Ruby on Rails podcast featuring Adam McCrae. He's the founder of Judoscale.
Okay, Judoscale.
Yeah, and Adam's been deep in the Rails world since, wow, way back in 2007. He actually started Judoscale as a side project back in 2016.
A side project. Interesting.
And then went full-time on it in 2021.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this then. Our goal today is to really understand why let's say, the usual ways of auto-scaling apps can sometimes miss the mark.
This is for Rails projects, yeah.
Right. And then explore how Judoscale offers a different angle, something that could potentially save you time, save you money, scaling. It's one of those things everybody talks about, right?
Oh, definitely. Always a hot topic.
I'm really interested in Adam's first steps with Rails. What got him started and what eventually set him on the path to creating Judoscale.
Okay, so his journey actually started back in 2001. Corporate IT world, mostly programming in C.
See, okay, old school.
Yeah. Then he moved into web dev, but it was classic ASP. And he wasn't, let's say, super thrilled with the corporate environment or the tech he was using at the time.
I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling.
Totally. And a big turning point for him was discovering the book Getting Real from 37 Signals.
Ah, yeah, the Basecamp folks.
Exactly. That book really resonated with him. It pushed him towards wanting to work for smaller companies, using better tools, a more efficient approach.
Makes sense.
So he started playing around with Rails around 2006, maybe 2007, then landed his first full-time Rails gig in 2007 at a company called EdgeCase.
EdgeCase, okay.
Stayed there for about 6 years, then moved on to work for a few different product companies. And here's the kicker. Judoscale was actually born as a side project while he was at one of those product companies.
Right, you mentioned that. It's often how the best tools start, isn't it? Solving your own problem.
Pretty much, the developer itch.
So let's get into Judoscale itself. What was the specific spark, like the real need that pushed him to say, okay, I need to build my own auto-scaling tool?
Yeah, the context here is really key. He was working at a company called Real HQ. They're known as Agent Pronto now.
Okay. What did they do?
Basically lead generation for real estate agents. And it was a small setup. The dev team was tiny, just 3 people.
3 people, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And around that time, Adam had just led this migration, moving their hosting from Engine Yard over to Heroku.
Which usually saves money.
It did. It saved them a good chunk. But they were still spending quite a bit on resources. Why? Because their app was just scaled up high, like constantly.
Even during quiet times.
Exactly. Even when traffic was low. They knew they needed to automate the scaling, obviously. But the options available back then, well, they weren't great.
How so?
They found them hard to use, difficult to configure, and honestly, not very reliable.
Okay.
So Adam, being a developer, that mindset kicks in, right? I can build something better. It didn't seem overly complex in his head at the time.
The famous last words of many projects.
Huh, maybe. But he talked to his boss, proposed building this thing as a side project, just for their internal use initially.
And the boss agreed.
Yeah, small team, pretty informal, so his boss was like, sure, go for it. And that's how he started tinkering with this Heroku autoscaler idea in his spare time.
Just for them initially.
Right. And it's worth saying, that first version, it was super basic, not even really an MVP, no UI at all.
Seriously, how did they configure it?
Directly through the production Rails console.
Whoa, okay. Brave.
Yeah. And it was built just for their one specific app.
Yeah.
It was really just a simple tool to test his core idea. Could scaling based on different metrics actually outperform the stuff they'd already tried?
And did it?
It did. It worked really well for them internally. And that success became the foundation, the proof of concept, for what eventually became Judoscale.
That's a great origin story, the classic scratch your own itch. So he saw this pain point, thought, I can code my way out of this. Now, the Judoscale website talks about being different from, the usual methods, CPU load, memory usage. How exactly does Judoscale approach it differently?
Exactly. If you look at the built-in auto-scaling on platforms like Heroku, Render, AWS, they generally use one of 2 main methods.
Okay.
Method 1 is compute-based. Basically, how busy is your CPU? Method 2, especially common on Heroku, is based on response time. How long does your app take to answer a request?
Right, and both have issues.
They do. With response time scaling.
Hmm.
Well, think about it. Every app has fast parts and slow parts, right?
Sure.
Like a complex report versus a simple page load. Exactly. And that slow part, it's going to stay slow no matter how many servers you throw at it. But it can still trigger scaling unnecessarily. Makes it really tricky to fine-tune.
Yeah, you end up paying for capacity you don't actually need for most requests.
Precisely. Then there's CPU-based scaling. It can be okay, maybe, for your main web servers, but it often falls short for background workers
Why is that?
because you can have a huge backlog of jobs building up, but your CPU usage might still look low. The bottleneck isn't the processor, something else.
Like waiting for an external API or database locks.
We're hitting thread limits, yeah, I/O waits, that kind of thing. So the CPU metric doesn't tell the whole story for workers.
Okay, so how does Judoscale tackle this? What's their metric?
This is where it gets really interesting. For web applications, Judoscale scales based on request queue time.
Request queue time, explain that.
It's the time between a request hitting the load balancer or the router, like Heroku's router, and the moment your Rails application actually picks it up to start processing.
Ah, so the time spent waiting in line before my code even sees it.
Exactly. Think of it like waiting in line at a coffee shop. The longer the line gets, the more overwhelmed the baristas are, right? That queue time directly shows how strained your app's capacity is.
And it's not skewed by how long the request takes inside Rails.
Right. A slow endpoint doesn't artificially inflate this metric. This helps prevent overscaling when you have high traffic. But the requests themselves are fast to process. Could save you real money on infrastructure.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense for web requests. What about the background jobs?
Similar idea, but for workers, it looks at job queue latency.
Like the latency number you see in a Sidekick dashboard?
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
You can basically tell Judoscale, look, I don't want my critical jobs waiting in the queue for more than, say, 5 seconds.
Okay.
And if that wait time starts creeping up, Judoscale automatically adds more worker resources to chew through that backlog faster. It keeps things responsive for your users.
Which is huge for customer satisfaction, obviously.
Def-
Okay, that whole approach feels really intuitive, simple almost. You don't want requests waiting too long. You don't want jobs waiting too long.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, why don't the platforms themselves, Heroku, AWS, typically use this method for their built-in autoscalers? What are the challenges? What's stopping them?
That's a really good question, and it gets to the heart of what these big platforms can and can't easily do. They need to build solutions that work for, well, everything.
All languages, all frameworks.
Exactly. So they have to operate at a higher, more general level. A metric like Sidekick job queue latency, that's super specific to Sidekick within the Ruby world.
Right. It requires knowing about Sidekick's internals.
Precisely.
Right.
To measure that, you need specific integrations adapters, basically for tools like Sidekick or SolidQ or Delayed Job. It's pretty unlikely a platform owner wants to build and maintain adapters for every single job library across every language they support.
Okay, that makes sense for workers. What about the request queue time for web?
Similar issue, actually. Measuring that wait time effectively requires code inside the application process itself, specifically middleware.
Ah, so Judoscale needs that Ruby gem installed in your Rails app.
Yep. That gem includes the middleware needed to capture that specific timing and report it back. The platform itself, sitting outside your app, can't easily get that metric.
So getting the metrics requires that framework-specific integration?
Right. Capturing and reporting the numbers isn't like rocket science.
Huh.
The real challenge Adam mentioned is actually on the back end.
Meaning Judoscale's backend.
Yeah. Taking all that data coming in from potentially thousands of apps, aggregating it smartly, and then developing the actual auto-scaling algorithms, deciding when to scale up, when to scale down, how much. That's the tricky part.
Interesting.
He even framed it interestingly. He said even though auto-scaling often feels like a DevOps problem, he actually sees Judoscale as more of a data science problem.
Despite not having a deep data science background himself.
Right. It's about interpreting those metrics and making intelligent decisions based on patterns and thresholds.
A data science problem in DevOps clothing. I like that. Okay, so we know Judoscale uses a Ruby gem. Let's talk about Judoscale's own tech stack. It's built with Ruby and Rails, right?
It is, yeah.
Some people might hear that and think, wait, an auto-scaling tool built in Ruby, wouldn't something like Go or a lower-level language be, faster or more efficient for that kind of system tooling? What's the take on that?
That's a fair question, But it kind of assumes autoscaling needs this super low-level bare metal speed.
Which it doesn't necessarily.
Not really if you think about how Judoscale works. It functions a lot like an APM tool or an analytics platform.
Collecting data and sending it off somewhere else.
Exactly. It collects a pretty small, focused set of metrics from your app, way fewer than a typical APM tool, actually, and just reports them back to its own servers.
And those servers, they're Rails.
Yep. The entire Judoscale backend is actually a Rails monolith.
A monolith. You don't hear that celebrated every day.
Huh. Well, it works for them. And the heavy lifting, the data analysis part, that doesn't necessarily demand a different language either. It mostly happens in their database.
Okay. What are they using?
They use Timescale DB. It's a powerful extension built on top of PostgreSQL, specifically designed for handling time series data really efficiently.
Ah, so it's optimized for storing and querying all those metrics over time.
Exactly. It handles storing the data, analyzing it, automatically managing how long they keep it, all that stuff. It takes the load off the Rails application layer.
So really, Judoscale is a fairly straightforward Rails app talking to a simple Ruby gem, and the performance-critical data stuff is handled by a specialized database.
Pretty much. The complexity is managed effectively by the database choice.
That makes a lot of sense. Leverage Rails for what it's good at: rapid development, ease of use, and use the right tool for the heavy data work.
Okay, so Judoscale obviously started with Rails, but you mentioned it supports other things too.
It does. Within the Ruby ecosystem, it also supports Sinatra and even just plain rack applications.
And then beyond Ruby, they've built integrations for Python covering frameworks like Django, Flask, Fastify, and some background job libraries there too. And they also support Node.js.
Wow, so quite a range now. But is Rails still the main focus?
Adam mentioned that even now, something like 90% of their customers are still running Rails apps.
90%. Why do you think that is?
Well, a few reasons probably. First, the original name was Rails Autoscale, right? So that clearly set the initial expectation.
True. Hard to shake that initial branding sometimes.
Yeah. And second, Adam himself is a longtime, very active member of the Rails community, so it was naturally easier for him to connect with potential users, get feedback, and promote the product within that world he knew so well.
Whereas he didn't have the same deep roots in the Python or Node communities.
Exactly. Less familiarity, fewer connections, makes it harder to gain traction.
Makes sense. So for these other frameworks, Python Node is the approach similar, integrating at that middleware or framework level to get the metrics.
Fundamentally, yes. The pattern is the same. Get inside the request lifecycle, monitor the job queues. But the specific integration points, the hooks into each framework, are obviously different.
Okay. And you mentioned plain rack apps too, beyond Sinatra.
Yeah.
How does that work if there's no framework like Rails doing auto configuration?
Good question. For Rails, they use Railties, which automatically wires up the Judoscale middleware when you add the gem. Super easy.
Right. Convention over configuration.
Exactly. For other rack-based apps, you just need one small manual step. You have to explicitly add the Judoscale middleware into your application's middleware stack yourself.
So just use judoscale.middleware or something like that in your config.ru.
Pretty much, yeah. Once you do that, it works the same way, collecting and reporting the metrics. Just a little bit of manual setup involved.
Okay, still sounds very manageable. Now, thinking about building Judoscale itself, were there any specific Rails features or maybe just the general Rails philosophy that Adam found particularly helpful?
He didn't really single out one specific feature, like Active Record or Action Cable. It was more about the overall, the ethos of Rails as the one-person framework.
The one-person framework, that's DHH's phrase, right?
Yeah. Adam really felt that was the key thing that enabled him to build Judoscale versus that side project and then grow it into a real business.
How so?
He emphasized that for most of its life, Judoscale was basically a solo effort. And he believes, because of how Rails is designed, it could still be run by just one person if necessary.
That's a powerful statement about the framework's productivity.
It really is. He sees Judoscale itself as kind of a testament to how effective that whole one-person framework idea can be in the real world.
That's a fantastic point, especially for you listening. If you're interested in efficiency and what one person can achieve with the right tools, we talk about this idea a lot, Rails enabling small teams or individuals to build big things.
And it's not just the back end. A big part of keeping it manageable as a solo dev or small team is controlling complexity on the front end too.
Right. Did he mention their front-end approach?
Yeah, they deliberately avoided a heavy single-page app framework. They used Turbo and Alpine.js. Much more integrated with Rails, Much simpler overall than maintaining a whole separate front-end build and API.
Which absolutely contributes to that one-person framework feel. Less context switching, fewer moving parts.
Exactly. It lowers the cognitive load significantly.
Now, managing that side project for 5 years while working full-time, that takes dedication. How did he manage his time?
He said it was mostly evenings and weekends, consistently, for those 5 years before he went full-time in 2021.
Wow.
But he stressed that he aimed for a sustainable pace. He wasn't trying to kill himself or burn out.
That's crucial for long-term side projects.
Absolutely. And the development was gradual, iterative. Started with that basic internal tool that added a simple UI, got it listed on the Heroku marketplace, then slowly added more features over time. Build, release, learn, repeat.
That iterative approach makes sense. It avoids that feeling of needing a massive launch. Okay, going back to Rails itself, you mentioned Adam started around 2006, 2007. He found it approachable then.
Yeah, he said his experience was pretty smooth getting started back then.
Yeah.
Much like you described your own experience, finding it intuitive.
It really did feel that way. Like the framework anticipated what you wanted to do. Conventions really helped.
He did contrast that with the period when Webpacker was the default for JavaScript. He felt that added a significant layer of complexity, especially for newcomers.
Oh, definitely. The Webpack era was challenging for many. Lots of configuration hurdles.
But he's optimistic now. He thinks the current state of Rails, with tools like Turbo and Stimulus, maybe ESBuild, it's possibly the most accessible it's ever been for new developers wanting that one-person framework experience.
I tend to agree. It felt for a while like everyone was rushing to decouple their front ends, build complex SPAs.
Right, the React or Vue front end talking to a Rails API backend.
Yeah, which often meant separate teams, more coordination, more complexity overall. It definitely feels like there's a swing back towards full stack Rails now.
I think there too. People are rediscovering the benefits of using what's in the box, keeping things simple.
Using Hotwire, Stimulus Reflex, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Reducing that accidental complexity.
Oh.
Although, Adam did offer one small caveat, a personal opinion.
Oh, about the current Rails stack.
Yeah, specifically about import maps.
Ah, the default way to handle JavaScript now, no build step needed. What was his take?
He said, while he's played with them for a couple of years, if he were starting a brand new Rails project today,
Yeah.
he probably wouldn't use them immediately.
Really? Why not?
He's found that pulling in third-party JavaScript libraries can still be surprisingly tricky sometimes, getting the pinning and importing right. It hasn't always been as smooth as he'd hoped.
Interesting. So he might prefer a lightweight build process instead, like sbuild.
Yeah, he suggested he'd probably lean towards just using the standard import instructions from the library itself, likely via a simple build tool, rather than wrestling with import map configurations.
Okay, that's valuable feedback from someone in the trenches. I haven't used import maps heavily myself yet, so it's good to hear about potential rough edges. The main challenge is just figuring out the right syntax for pinning and then importing.
Yeah, exactly. He described it as sounding straightforward. Find the package on a CDN like JS Deliver, pin it, then import it in your JS. But he admitted spending, quote, more time than I care to admit getting those two steps to line up correctly for certain packages.
Fair enough. Good to know. All right, let's take a quick moment here for a word from our sponsor. And we are back on the deep dive. We were just talking about the nuances of the Rails stack. It's fascinating how Judoscale leverages being inside the Rails framework to get metrics that the platforms themselves can't easily access. Adam mentioned getting those Ruby metrics wasn't the hardest part. So what was? What were the biggest hurdles in building Judoscale?
Right. He reiterated that the Ruby side was relatively straightforward for him. The biggest technical challenges came when building the adapters for Python and Node.js.
Because of less familiarity.
Exactly. Just not having that same deep intuitive understanding of the ecosystems and the frameworks. But beyond the language adapters, he emphasized that the real ongoing challenge is refining the core logic.
The data aggregation and the auto-scaling algorithm itself.
Yep. Figuring out the absolute best way to crunch those numbers and decide when to scale. He said it's been a constant process of iteration and learning, and it's still ongoing. They're always tweaking it.
And exploring new metrics too, right? You mentioned request queue time is still reactive.
Exactly. It's a great metric, much better than CPU or response time in many cases, but it only signals a problem as it's happening or just about to happen.
So for really sudden spikes.
Yeah, some customers have traffic patterns that ramp up incredibly fast. So fast that even Judoscale, reacting to queue time, might not trigger scaling quite quickly enough to prevent a brief overload, because there's always that lag while the platform, Heroku, AWS, whatever, actually spins up the new servers.
Right, platform provisioning time is a factor.
Definitely. So they are actively researching additional metrics, maybe more proactive ones, that could help anticipate those spikes even earlier.
Fascinating. Okay, let's walk through a scenario. My Rails app has the Judoscale gem. It's running on, say, a Heroku web dyno. Request queue time starts climbing. How does the actual scaling happen? Walk me through the flow.
Okay, so first, the middleware inside your Rails app captures that queue time for every single request,
Okay.
on every request.
Then there's a separate background thread running within your Rails process. Periodically, about every 10 seconds, this thread bundles up all those collected queue time metrics,
Got it. Bundle them up and does what?
sends them off to the Judoscale backend servers.
The Rails monolith we talked about. Exactly. Once the data hits their backend, their analytics engine runs. It compares your app's current metrics against the rules and thresholds you've configured in your Judoscale settings.
Scale up if queue time exceeds X seconds, that sort of thing.
Right. If the algorithm decides scaling is needed up or down, Judoscale then makes an API call out to your hosting platform.
So it calls the Heroku API or the AWS API directly.
Yep, it tells the platform, hey, add another dyno or
Yeah.
remove a server using the platform's own API.
Okay, that closes the loop. The
Yeah.
gem reports, Judoscale decides, Judoscale tells the platform to act. Makes sense. Now, looking back at the whole journey since 2016, building this thing from scratch, hindsight is 2020, right? Is there anything Adam would do fundamentally differently if he started Judoscale today?
He thought about that. He mentioned, they went through various tech choices early on, CoffeeScript, AML, different ways of storing the data before landing on Timescale DB.
Right, the usual evolution of a long-running project.
Yeah. He said, obviously, starting today, he'd leverage their current stack and avoid those earlier missteps. But the bigger question he wrestled with internally was about language support.
Whether to have gone multi-language so early.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Should they have just stayed laser-focused on Rails initially, instead of branching out to Python and Node? He admitted the ROI, the return on investment for their Ruby development and support, has been way higher.
Because of his expertise and the larger customer base there.
Right. More familiarity, easier support, more users.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been more efficient for them compared to Python, where they have fewer customers and less internal expertise.
So is he saying he would have focused only on Rails if starting today?
It sounds like it's still an internal debate they have sometimes, but ultimately he concluded that no, Judoscale will stay multi-language. It's part of their identity now.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It really highlights that point, though. Building in a language or framework, deeply is just so much faster and more efficient.
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
feels like anything I try to do in a less familiar stack takes like 3 times longer.
Totally relate. And Python, like JavaScript, keeps evolving, doesn't it? If you haven't used it heavily in a few years, you feel like you're starting over sometimes.
Definitely. Things change fast.
So on that note, any plans to add more languages? Or are they sticking with Ruby, Python, and Node for now? This might be roadmap stuff, I guess.
He was pretty clear.
Yeah.
No current plans to add more languages right now.
Okay. What's the focus instead?
Lately, it's been all about expanding their platform integrations, adding support for places like Render, Fly.io, AWS, Railway, more hosting options.
Broadening where Judoscale can run rather than what languages it supports.
Exactly. He suggested future expansion is much more likely to be on the platform side. Adding a new language means learning a whole new ecosystem, building new adapters, supporting it. It's a big lift, especially without deep familiarity.
Whereas adding a new platform is more about integrating with that platform's API.
Right. Likely a more contained effort. He did toss out Laravel PHP as maybe the next logical language if they were to expand.
Interesting. Given Laravel's popularity and similarity to Rails in some ways.
Yeah, but he immediately noted that Laravel recently launched Laravel Cloud, which has its own built-in auto-scaling. So that might create some competition or overlap there.
Right. It's funny, there used to be that almost stereotypical rivalry between Ruby and PHP devs.
Oh yeah, the flame wars back in the day.
But now it feels like Rails and Laravel are kind of philosophically aligned in many ways, both emphasizing developer productivity, conventions.
Adam actually mentioned feeling a sort of spiritual alignment with Laravel and its community, even without having used it much himself.
Huh. So maybe there's a future for Judoscale with Laravel Cloud eventually, if their built-in scaling has the same limitations as other platforms.
He kind of hinted at that possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
Speculated that maybe Laravel's native auto-scaling might run into similar constraints, where a tool like Judoscale could still add value by looking at those deeper metrics. time will tell, I guess.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to those platform integrations themselves. Render, AWS, Fly. What were the challenges there? Any interesting architectural hurdles?
He said it was kind of a mixed bag. The render integration, which was one of their first after Heroku, actually took a long time.
Really? Was Render's API difficult?
No, surprisingly, it wasn't Render's fault. It was because they discovered just how tightly coupled their own code base had become to Heroku over the years.
Ah, lots of implicit assumptions baked in.
Exactly. They had to do a fair bit of refactoring, kind of peeling back the layers, as you mentioned, to make their system more platform agnostic before they could properly integrate Render.
That's a common story when expanding from a single platform. What about AWS?
AWS had its own set of challenges,
Mm.
mostly around IAM permissions. Getting the security configuration right can be complex. Plus, Adam admitted to not having deep AWS experience initially, and maybe some personal reservations about its complexity.
Understandable. AWS can be daunting.
But he said after those initial hurdles with Render and AWS, subsequent integrations with platforms like Fly.io and Railway have been generally much smoother, mostly just a case of learning and integrating with each platform's specific API.
Okay. And when Judoscale needs to tell Heroku or AWS to scale, how does that command actually get sent? You mentioned API calls, but is it synchronous?
Asynchronous.
Yeah, okay.
Asynchronous.
Yeah.
They use Sidekick background jobs on their end.
Ah, so the scaling decision triggers a sidekick job.
Yeah. They have separate jobs for scaling up and scaling down. These jobs run frequently, like every 10 seconds, checking if the algorithm has flagged a need to scale, and if so, they make the API call to the relevant platform.
That keeps their main application responsive, avoids blocking on those potentially slow API calls.
Exactly. Decouples the decision from the execution.
And architecturally, handling those different platforms. You mentioned peeling back layers. Did they end up with something like an adapter pattern?
Pretty much, yeah. He described their internal structure using the concept of teams in Judoscale.
Teams, how does that work?
Each team you create within your Judoscale account is tied to one specific hosting platform. So if you use both Heroku and AWS, you'd set up two separate teams.
Okay.
And then in their code base, they basically have subclasses of a core team. A Heroku team, an AWS team, a render team, etc.
And each subclass overrides the platform-specific methods.
Exactly. Methods for like get current scale, set new scale, get metrics API endpoint. Whatever differs between the platforms is handled in those specific subclasses. A classic object-oriented approach to managing variation.
That sounds like a really clean way to handle it. Very extensible for adding new platforms later, too.
Seems like it, yeah.
Okay, so Adam built this successful product, largely solo initially, bootstrapping it. That's really inspiring. For listeners out there who might be thinking about starting their own side project, maybe building a sauce tool, does he have any key advice based on his experience?
He was a little hesitant, actually. He prefaced it by saying, look, he's not some serial entrepreneur with dozens of hits. Judoscale is his main success story.
Fair enough. Humility is good.
But based on that experience, his core advice was start really small, like incredibly small.
Smaller than you think.
Probably. Build the absolute minimum viable thing that provides genuine utility, real value, to at least one person.
Okay. Minimum utility, not just minimum features.
Right. And ideally, that person would even be willing to pay for it. But even if not initially, the crucial thing is someone actually using it regularly?
Not just installing it to be nice, but actively relying on it.
Exactly. Because it solves a real problem for them. He feels that if you can't even get to that point, one person using it consistently because they need it, then the idea probably doesn't have legs as a business. The regular usage is the strongest form of early validation.
That really resonates with the saying, the best market validation is a paying customer, or at least a genuinely engaged user.
Pretty much. Solve a real pain point first.
Great advice. Okay, one last question. Looking forward a bit, we talked about different platforms. Is there any possibility of Judoscale supporting like a multi-cloud setup within a single instance? Say I have web workers on Heroku, but maybe some background jobs running on Fly.io, and I want Judoscale to manage both from one dashboard.
He said, it's actually possible now, but the way you do it is by creating those multiple teams we discussed. You'd have a Heroku team and a Fly.io team within your Judoscale account.
Ah, okay. So it works, but it's managed as separate entities within Judoscale.
Right. He did say that specific need managing truly hybrid setups across different providers for a single application hasn't been super common among their users so far.
Interesting.
But he shared a related learning on the platform side. Before they built out robust AWS support, they didn't fully appreciate how common it is for companies to use totally separate AWS accounts for staging versus production.
Oh yeah, that's standard practice for isolation and security.
Right. But because of Judoscale's architecture, one team per platform account,
Yeah.
that meant those companies needed two separate Judoscale teams, and therefore two separate Stripe subscriptions, just to cover staging and production on AWS.
Ouch. That's not ideal from a user perspective.
No, he acknowledged it was a lesson learned and a result of their early architectural choices that would now be pretty difficult and disruptive to change. Just one of those things you discover as you grow and encounter more diverse user setups.
Absolutely. Those real-world usage patterns always uncover the edge cases in your design. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. We are just about out of time, so I really want to thank Adam McCrae via the original podcast interview, of course, for sharing so much detail about Judoscale and his journey.
Yeah, it was a great conversation to dig into. Lots of practical stuff about scaling, building a sauce, the Rails ecosystem. Really valuable.
For everyone listening, if you're intrigued and want to learn more about Judoscale, you can check them out at judoscale.com. That's Judoscald.com.
And we'd love to hear what you thought about this deep dive. Did it spark any ideas? Any follow-up questions?
Definitely. Send us your comments, questions, maybe even a voice memo. You can email us at comments@rubyonrailspodcast.com. We might even feature your feedback in a future chat.
Please do.
A huge thank you, as always, goes out to our editor, Paul, over at Petrie Sound, for making us sound good.
And to our producer, John Neneker.
And most importantly, thank you, our listener, for tuning in and joining us for this exploration.
Yeah, thanks for being here with us.
And finally, just a little something to chew on. Think about this trade-off between tools that are deeply integrated with a specific framework, like Judoscale is with Rails, versus tools designed to be more general, more platform agnostic.
Right, the specialist versus the generalist tool.
What are the real pros and cons there? Deep integration gets you powerful, specific features, but maybe less flexibility. Agnostic tools work everywhere, but might lack that deep insight.
And in today's world, with so many different languages, frameworks, and platforms, how do you decide what level of abstraction, what kind of tool is right for your specific needs and your project? Something to think about.